It felt lonesome in the void, a kind of loneliness that went beyond the absence of company. It was the kind of loneliness that hollowed you out from the inside, that made your own breath, if it had existed in that place, feel like a betrayal of the silence. Out here, silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. It had mass. It stretched outer like an infinite ocean of black ink, viscous and thick, swallowing everything: hope, memory, reason. No stars broke the horizon. No planets floated nearby to remind us that we belonged to anything. There were no suns to cast warmth or shadows. There was only the bleak, suffocating vacuum. A total absence of sound, of time, of gravity, of life. We were suspended in a place where the universe had seemingly forgotten us. Not lost. Abandoned. He floated on the right. I drifted to the left. Two specks of life in an eternal dead sea, tethered by invisible threads of history and resentment. The vacuum between us wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and emotional. We hadn't spoken in years. We hadn't needed to. There was an agreement, unspoken and absolute, that language had no place in our exile. Words had died long ago, suffocated in the same void that claimed everything else. We never broke the silence. Not once. But that didn't mean there was peace. Instead, thoughts swirled, sharp, fractured, relentless. They ricocheted inside our skulls like debris from a shirked war. My thoughts, his thoughts, they twisted and tangled, brushed against each other like static charges. There was no privacy in this limbo, no shelter from the relentless echo of our own minds. It was noise, constant and intangible, a storm of remembrance and regret without thunder or rain. It was a maddening kind of silence, not calm, not serene. It was a silence that screamed. It curled around the ribs and coiled in the gut, turning breathless stillness into unbearable pressure. It pressed against the brain like a vice, turning seconds into centuries. But despite it all, there was something between us. Something more than silence. A connection. Something deeper. Older. A tether woven from shared trauma and bitter understanding. A bond as fragile as cracked glass, but as enduring as gravity. It endured not because we wanted it to, but because we couldn't let go of each other. Not after everything. I could feel his emotions radiating outward in waves, sharp, hot pulses of fury that throbbed through the void like phantom heartbeats. His fists were always clenched, his jaw always tight, as though the very emptiness was an enemy he could fight if only he squeezed hard enough. There was sorrow in him, too. Deep, unspoken sorrow that curled in the corners of his eyes and tightened the space around him. I saw it, felt it, even though there was no light to reflect it. His grief was gravitational, pulling me toward him against my will. But I never crossed that hidden line. I never reached out. I couldn't. He had done this. He had built this prison, brick by invisible brick, and dragged me into it without remorse, without pause. And even now, after all this time, he bore it without apology, without acknowledging the cost. That was his nature, arrogant, impulsive, blind to consequence. A child wielding cosmic tools with no understanding of the destruction he drove. 16 years. 16 years we drifted, unmoored, forgotten by time, and untouched by the living. Our bodies may have remained intact, flesh encased in suits that had long since become part of us, but our minds were crumbling, not in sudden collapse, but in slow erosion. The kind of decay that eats away quietly, invisibly, until nothing of substance remains. I was unraveling. I could feel it. Once, my mind had been a fortress, ordered, sharp, precise. Now it was a ruin. Threadbare memories fluttered through the corridors, barely clinging to form. Faces I once loved blurred into smoke. Names lost their edges. What day it was, what year, those things had long since dissolved into abstraction. All that remained was the now. This moment. This drift. Him. Me. The passage of time no longer meant anything. There was no sun to rise, no clocks to count, no stars to mark change. The void erased all sense of movement, of direction, of duration. Days bled into each other like spilled ink, time pooling around us until it became indistinguishable from the dark. I was losing myself, bit by bit, breath by breath. Each thought that failed to anchor, each memory that slipped through my fingers, chipped away at who I had once been. I was becoming less. Not dying. Just thinning. And through it all, he remained. Silent. Distant. Yet always present. I could feel his despair, as raw and deep as mine, though he refused to wear it on the surface. He had walls I could never breach, defenses built from pride and shame, mortared with guilt. He was every bit as lost as I was, but he wore his delusion like armor. He pretended the silence didn't weigh on him, that the years hadn't carved hollows into his soul. But I knew, because I could feel him tremble sometimes, even if only barely. In the long stretches of stillness, I could sense it, the quiet gasp of a thought too painful to bear, the flicker of a memory he didn't want to see. We were the same in that way. Stripped of everything, we were two bare souls, floating in the aftermath of something neither of us could fix. Trapped. Together. Forever. Not dead. But no longer alive. Just drifting. There was a certain kind of madness that came with this kind of isolation. A quiet madness, patient and slow. It didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in like fog, seeping into the edges of my consciousness without warning. At first, it was just a whisper, a vague feeling, a flickering at the periphery of thought, like the moment before you forget a word you've always known. Harmless. Fleeting. Easy to ignore. But time stretched on like taut wire, endlessly coiling around me, and the whisper began to speak more clearly. It wore the voice of my own thoughts, but twisted, just slightly off, just alien enough to make me question their origin. The line between who I had been and what I was becoming blurred. It wasn't a fracture. It was erosion, slow, relentless. A crumbling of the mind, grain by grain, until there was no solid ground left beneath me. And in that slow disintegration, I felt the last vestiges of my sanity slipping through the cracks, dissolving into the endless silence that loomed between us. And yet, we stayed. Day after meaningless day. Bound by the void. Entangled not by walls, but by time, by memory, by guilt. Two figures adrift in an infinite graveyard of stars that no longer existed. We didn't speak. We couldn't. The silence was too heavy. It was thick like oil, black, clinging, unyielding. It filled every space between us, poured into our mouths, and lodged in our lungs. It replaced language with stillness, and sound with understanding so old it had lost its name. There were no clocks and no calendars, but I knew the years had passed. I could feel them etched into the ache in my bones, in the way my thoughts slowed, stretched, unraveled. I will never forget how it felt, to be lost in the void with him. Both of us were alive, yet unable to reach each other, unable to break the surface of that oppressive silence that had consumed us both. At some point, I don't know when, maybe in year 9, maybe in year 15, I told myself I would speak. I would finally look at him, reach out, and break the wall. But I didn't. My pride was an iron anchor, forged from bitterness and hurt. My ego, my stubbornness, wrapped around me like a Wednesday. I told myself it was his fault. He brought us here. He made the choices. He deserved the silence. So I said nothing. I looked away. I stayed. Until he made a sound. A real sound. Not imagined. Not dreamed. A raw, human sound that ripped through the vacuum like a knife tearing through flesh. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again. A trembling, choked exhale of anguish, a shudder that passed from his body like an aftershock. His dreams had begun to change. They had always been there, I think, flickering behind his eyes when he closed them. But now, they grew teeth. They became monstrous, grotesque, snarling specters of his past. Each night, I watched him writhe, twitch, claw at invisible terrors. They weren't dreams anymore, they were visitations. Apparitions pulled from the darkest corners of his mind. They didn't simply haunt him. They hunted him. They fed on the pieces of him he had tried to bury, the child he had been, the wounds he never let heal. They tore at him, bit into the soft, hidden places he'd spent a lifetime fortifying. I saw the toll it took. His face, already pale from years without sunlight, became drawn and hollow. His hands trembled in waking moments, twitching as though remembering the claws, the teeth, the cold voices from the abyss. There was no peace for him. Sleep had become another battlefield, one where he always mislaid. He had tried to bury them, long ago. The memories, the pain, the voices of parents whose names had turned to ash on his tongue. The echoes of love he never believed he deserved. He'd told himself he could forget, that he had moved on, that whatever softness had once lived in him had died and been buried beneath rage and reason. But nothing stays buried in the void. The dam he'd built, so meticulously crafted out of denial and logic, finally cracked. And when it burst, it wasn't subtle. It was cataclysmic. The scream that came from him was not just a sound, it was an eruption. A rupture in the fabric of space itself, or so it felt. It came from deep within, primal and raw, not shaped by words or thought, but by sheer emotional force. It shook the silence around us and made the vacuum tremble. I swear, even the darkness flinched. It was pain distilled to its purest form, grief unfiltered, grief that had gone unanswered for too long. I watched him. I couldn't look away. And for the first time in all those endless years, I saw him, not the man I had blamed, not the figure I had chosen to resent, but him. The boy beneath the sea. The child who had lost everything and had never been taught how to grieve. He had always been alone, long before we found this exile. That scream wasn't just for now. It was for then. For the boy who cried into his pillow when no one came. For the teenager who learned to hide behind anger because it was easier than crying. For the man who carried 1,000 unspoken regrets like weights chained to his soul. My gaze softened. Something in me shifted. I saw him now, the shaking hands, the slight tremble in his lips, the way his body curled inward as if trying to protect something broken inside. All the fury, the coldness, the stubborn silence, it had been camouflaged. A shell, a mask. And I understood. He had been drowning long before the void took us. He had always lived in a kind of silence. Not the silence of space, but the silence of being unheard, unseen, untouched. Now I saw him, not just as the architect of my suffering, but as a mirror. And for the first time in 16 years, I wanted to speak. Not to accuse, not to punish, but to reach. I felt his turmoil as if it were my own, like a storm passing through my chest, tearing at the stillness within me. The space between us meant nothing anymore. Pain, I had learned, did not need proximity to be shared. His body betrayed him long before his voice did. His shoulders, once square with defiance, now hunched forward, caved inward as if the sorrow had broken his spine. He looked smaller, as though the weight of grief had compressed him into himself, folding layer upon layer of pain until all that remained was a trembling shell barely holding together. Each breath he drew was shallow and trembling, dragged in as if from beneath water like a man trying not to drown. I watched the way his chest rose and fell, too fast, too unsteady, and I knew he was suffocating inside his own silence. The tears he refused to shed glistened in the corners of his eyes, not yet released, restrained by sheer, brutal will. But I saw the cracks forming, hairline fractures spreading across the mask he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, fingers twitching with barely contained rage and sorrow. Each twitch, each tremor was a scream his body couldn't voice. Every muscle in him was taut, shaking from the effort it took not to fall apart. I didn't speak. What words could I offer that wouldn't shatter under the weight of what he carried? The language was too small for this, too frail. My silence wasn't indifference, it was reverence. Reverence for his pain, for the deep, howling wound inside him that no one had ever seen clearly, until now. In that moment, I finally saw him, truly saw him. Not as the angry, lashing figure I had grown to resent. Not as the defiant man who seemed made of stone and fire. But as what he truly was, a man unraveling. A boy who had never been taught how to grieve. A soul whose wounds had never closed. He wasn't just angry. He was fractured. Shattered into jagged pieces of memory and longing, of unspoken grief and unloved years. And each of those pieces cried out, not just in rage, but in sorrow, for the father who abandoned him, for the mother who never came back, for the home that never felt safe. He was a mosaic of absence, a living echo of the love he never received, of the warmth he'd been denied since the beginning. And now those fragments were rising, feral and loud, demanding to be heard, no longer content to be buried in silence. He wasn't alone in his suffering. I knew that now. But for him, it must have felt like eternity spent dragging a broken heart through a black sky, waiting for anyone, to notice the blood trail he left behind. His grief had festered in solitude, untouched by compassion, unspoken for so long that it had become a second skin. He wore it the way others wore armor. And as I stood there, watching him, I felt the gravity of his pain pulling at me like a riptide. It would have been easy to sink into it, to let it pull me under, too. But I didn't. I stayed rooted. Not because I was strong, but because I understood something then. This wasn't just his pain. It was our pain. Woven from the same cloth, cut from different sides of the same impairment. I didn't know how to help him. I wasn't even sure I could. But I knew one thing with perfect clarity. I couldn't turn away. Not now. Not when he was so close to breaking. Then his gaze met mine. It was sharp, piercing, like a blade slipped between ribs. His eyes, usually dull with silence, were suddenly aflame. There was nothing soft in that look. No vulnerability. No invitation. His stare wasn't searching for understanding. It was an accusation, a sentence passed without trial. In that single look, I felt every ounce of blame he had ever swallowed, every unspoken belief that he had been wronged by fate, by family, by me. His eyes screamed, "You did this. You let this happen. You watched me fall." And in a flash, the fragile vulnerability I had just seen flickered out, hidden behind the familiar armor. The mask of defiance snapped into place with practiced precision, cold, unyielding, cruel. He turned from me with a jerk, his whole body stiff with rejection. One trembling hand rose to his face in a desperate, futile attempt to erase the evidence of what had just broken loose. Tears and snot smeared across his cheek, and I watched him wipe it all away with a haste born of shame. He wasn't hiding from me, he was hiding from himself, from the softness he had dared to touch, if only for a moment. Then his voice, low, hoarse, fractured, cut through the space between us. Eden, he muttered like the name itself was blasphemy on his tongue. It wasn't just bitterness. It was contempt, grief, fear, vulnerability wrapped in barbed wire. "You think you're so perfect," he hissed, his voice quaking, edged with venom. "Why won't you just go away? Why are you still here? Are you the devil? Or God? Because if you're God," his voice cracked, a raw wound splitting wide, "why did you let my mother die? Why did you poison my family with sickness?" The questions hit like bullets, each one laced with agony, each syllable soaked in grief so deep it made the air taste like ash. His voice broke again at the word mother like it had pierced something still raw and open. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. His fury was volcanic, yes, but beneath it was something far more devastating. The trembling, aching plea of a boy who had prayed and never received an answer. The pain he poured into that moment, it wasn't just about me. I knew that. It was the pain of every door that had never opened, every scream into the void that had never been answered. And yet, I was his target. Because I was there. Because I stayed. And that, perhaps, was what terrified him most. Because deep down, maybe he wasn't asking me to leave. Maybe, finally, he was asking me not to. His body trembled, each muscle drawn taut like a wire strung too tight, every sinew thrumming with the tension of barely restrained fury. He looked like he might break apart from the pressure, as if his skin could no longer contain the storm raging beneath it. Then, with a violent snap of motion, he whirled around. His movements were sharp, filled with volatile purpose, like a blade pulled from its sheath. His eyes met mine, and they were blazing. Fierce, unrelenting, the kind of fire born not from hatred, but from a lifetime of unanswered questions and unwept tears. His chest rose and fell in jagged bursts, each breath like a battle waged against collapse. The air around him seemed to vibrate with the sheer intensity of what he held inside. His grief wasn't passive. It was kinetic, a hurricane trying to find a direction. Then came his voice, loud, thunderous, raw. What kind of God follows a kid like me around, trying to break me? Just like you broke the rest of this world, answer me." His words tore through the vacuum like a scream breaking 1,000 years of silence. His arms shot upward, fists clenched so tightly I thought he might draw blood. His whole frame shook like he was made of fury and grief and nothing else. That question, shouted into the emptiness, wasn't meant to be answered with words. It was a howl hurled at the heavens, daring the universe to reply. "Answer me when I speak to you." He took a step forward, his voice rising to a pitch that cracked and splintered on the edges. No longer fury alone, but desperation. Raw, unfiltered. His pain had no disguise now. "When I pray to you, I'm looking you in the face now, and you can't ignore me anymore." That final line, punctuated by a break in his voice, shattered something inside me. It was a rupture. A boy screaming not just at God, not just at the void, but at the father who never came home. At the mother who left too soon. At the universe that never answered back. And suddenly, the fury was only half of it. The rest was grief. Blistering, ancient, and utterly human. He stood before me, shaking, breathing hard, his chest heaving as though he'd just run through all the years of his life. And for the first time, I didn't see him as a storm I had to weather or a puzzle I had to solve. I saw him for what he truly was, a soul in ruins, wading through the wreckage of a life that never gave him a chance to be whole. I stood frozen, stunned by the sheer force of what he had laid bare. All the distance I had once placed between us, philosophical, emotional, moral, it vanished. He wasn't beneath me. He wasn't broken by me. He was just human. Another soul tossed into the abyss, screaming for a light that never came. Carefully, slowly, I stepped forward. Each movement felt monumental, like one wrong breath could unravel him all over again. I didn't know what I was offering. Maybe it was comfort. Maybe it was absolution. Maybe it was nothing but presence. But I moved toward him anyway, hoping that just being there might be enough. But before I could close the distance, he recoiled. Hard. As if my touch would set him ablaze. "Leave me alone." He screamed it, but his voice cracked under the weight of the command. There was no malice in it now. Only pain. "You did this to me." His scream fractured the silence again, and this time, it sounded less like rage and more like surrender. The kind of surrender that comes not from peace, but from being too tired to keep pretending you're whole. He staggered backward, then forward, his body faltering, unsure where to go, unsure if there was anywhere left to run. And then, finally, the fight left him. He tumbled, not gracefully, not dramatically, but like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His knees buckled beneath him, and he fell forward into me, his weight hitting my chest like an avalanche of grief. I caught him. Barely. His arms didn't wrap around me. They hovered at his sides, then reached upward in feeble, frantic movements, fingers clawing at the air, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. And then I heard it. A sound so small, so broken, it felt as though the universe itself had cracked. A whimper. It wasn't just sorrow. It was annihilation in a single breath. A noise not meant to be heard, but to escape. A sound is born from the place where language dies and only feeling remains. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Why? Just one word. One syllable, soft and shivering, spoke like a prayer that no longer believed in itself. It hung in the air like smoke, like ash drifting from the aftermath of something sacred that had been burned to the ground. That one word contained multitudes, rage, grief, confusion, longing. It echoed through me, through the silence, through every part of me that had ever asked the same question. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There were no words that would make sense of his pain. No explanation that could rewind the years, rewrite the tragedies, or erase the absence he had grown up in like a second skin. I had nothing to offer but stillness. Nothing to give but presence. And so, I held him. Not tightly. Not with certainty. I just held him. The weight of his grief pressed into me like gravity, infinite and merciless. It settled into my bones. I could feel the years in it. The lifetimes. All the nights he had cried alone. All the mornings he had wished would never come. And in that moment, I realized something truly, horribly simple. There are some wounds that never close. Some questions that have no answers. Some griefs that live in us forever, not to be healed, but to be carried.